Hello again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Advanced PHP with MySQL course. In today's lesson, we're going to be continuing development of our web application, incorporating what we learned on our last lesson on running select queries from within a PHP script. The new version of the web application that we're going to be working with today is version 15.0, and basically what we're going to be doing is we're going to be making use of select queries within our database access class, which is a class we created in our last version of the web application that basically encapsulates all of our access to a MySQL database. We're going to add functionality to that class that we're going to be able to run select statements to basically load items from the database. In our last web application, we learned how to insert items into the database from our admin page, and now we're going to basically run some select queries to be able to load items from the database. So basically in our database access class, we've added three public methods. One is called getItem, which you pass it an item ID, and it's going to load an item from the MySQL database. It's the same functionality as getItem that we had in filelib.php, except that it's loading from a database rather than items.txt. Similarly, we have getItems, which is going to load an array of all of the items in the database. So it's basically going to run a select query on our items table and then create an item object for each row in that table. Again, that sort of models the behavior that we've had in our getItems function in filelib.php. And then we're also creating an itemExist function, which basically tests whether an item exists or not in the particular database. You pass it an item ID, and what it's going to do is basically run a select query. If the query returns a result, then based on that item ID, then we're going to know that the item exists in the particular database, or in our database. One of the things that we're going to make use of in getItem and getItems is we've also created or added a private helper function to this database access class called buildItemFromRow. And basically what we're going to be doing is, we know that we learned in our last lesson, when we run a select query, we can call the fetch object method on the result set object that's returned from running the query, and that's basically going to take the current row and put it into an object form. It makes it an object of, if you remember, standard class, which is basically a basic object in PHP. What we're going to do is when we basically fetch a row from our items database, we're going to be passing that row object to this buildItemFromRow function, and what it's going to do is basically just build up our item object. We have an item object that we've been using all throughout the web application that basically has all the data of an item, its ID, its name, its description, and so on. And basically this is just going to be sort of a function that's going to transfer from a row in the database to an actual item object. So let's take a look at what our new functions look like. If we look at our database access class in version 15.0, we can see that we've added three new methods: getItem, getItems, and itemExist. Blow this up a little more. If we look at our getItem method, we can see that basically what it does is it takes an item ID, and then it uses that item ID to create a select query. And we're saying select all of the columns from the items table where the item ID equals the item ID that we've passed in. And then we have a debug message that's just going to log our query to help us debug problems with it. And then we go ahead and run the select query. And as we learned in our last lesson, this is going to return a result, an object, assuming that there are rows that were returned, of the MySQLi underscore result type. It's going to be a result set object, which is going to get stored in this result variable. We know that that MySQLi result set object has a property called numRows, which basically says the number of rows that were returned as a part of that query. Basically, we're going to check to see if the number of rows is equal to, in this case, not equal to 1. If it's not equal to 1, that means that either it was 0 or there was an error, meaning that we have multiple items with that ID in our database, which shouldn't happen because it's the primary key. So basically, if it's not equal to 1, it's going to be 0. We're going to return false. This function will actually, it's either going to return a built-up item or it's going to return false if that item doesn't exist in the database. If it does exist, meaning that number of rows is equal to 1, then we're going to call that buildItemFromRow function that we had talked about and just talked about in the last slide. And basically what we're doing is we're passing it the output of result fetch object. So there's only one row in our result set. we're calling the fetch object method on that result set object, which is going to return a standard class object, which is going to have all of the columns in our table mapped to properties in that object, and then we pass it to this build item from row class. And won't be able to see that here in the documentation because it only documents public methods, but if we actually look at the source code for the file, we'll be able to see that private method. And basically what build item from row does is it simply takes that row object, which is, again, it's that standard class that basically maps each column to a property in that class, and then we just access all of the different properties of that row object and build up an item object using the items constructor. Let's see. So that's how our getItem class works. It runs this query that has a where clause that will only select a particular item that's requested from the database, and then it will run that query and then basically build up an item object from the row that's returned. The other method that we have is getItems is similar, except that we're going to be loading all of the items from the database, all of the items in our items table. One of the places that we use that is on our add item to department form. We have a drop-down box that lists all of the different items to add to a department. Well, that drop-down box uses this getItems method to load all of the items from the database. So it actually is going to, we're going to create a query called select star from items, which is going to say give me all the columns for all of the items in the items table. And then we go ahead and we run that query. And basically we perform a test to see if any rows were returned. Maybe we have an items table that has no items in it so far. So if items row is not greater than 0, that means it's equal to 0, we're going to return false, just to let the whoever calls this method know that there are no items in the table. If it's greater than 0, that means some rows were returned. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to create this array, indexed array called items, and we're going to loop over the result set object, and for each row in the row that's returned, we're going to build an item object and add it to this items array. So here we have the construct that we saw in our last lesson, where we have a while loop that basically calls this fetch object method continuously until it returns null, and it returns null once it's reached the end of the result set. We store that object temporarily in this variable row, and then just as we did in our last, in the getItem function, we're going to build an item object from that row, and then we're going to store it in our items array, and then we simply return that items array to our user. And then finally, the last function that we've added, or method that we've added to this class, is an itemsExist function. And that actually makes use of a select query as well. It actually makes use of the same select query that we used in getItem. We're basically saying, give me all of the columns for an item in the items table where the item ID equals this item ID that was passed in. So basically, if we run that query, and we're not actually concerned with the data that it returns, we don't care about the name, the item, the price, and all that information. All we want to know is, did it return a result, which means that, and that item does exist in the database. So we run that query, and then we just test the number of rows. If the number of rows it returns equals 1, which means that there was that item was in the database and it returned 1 row, we return true. Otherwise, we return false. And so that's how we test for an item in our database. Now these new functions that we've added, we make use of them in a couple of different files within our web application, because right now we haven't set up our departments. We had our items database basically stored previously in flat file called items.txt. And we had our departments information stored in a file called departments.txt. We haven't talked about how to model the departments.txt in our database yet, so we aren't basically implementing any select statements yet for loading departments from the database. So basically what we have here is these are all the scripts that make use of loading items, that load items from the database. The couple of scripts we have are department.php, which if we look at the department page on our web application, it calls getItem when it builds up this table. The department object for this particular page is going to have an array of item IDs, and then it's going to go ahead and call this getItem method to load each of these items up. So that's how it'll be used in department.php. Item.php, obviously we're going to be using the getItem method to pull all the information from the database for a particular item so that we can output it. ViewCart.php, when we add items to a cart, it lists them all in the shopping cart table that we have on that page. So that's going to make use of the getItem method to be able to load each item to output it as a row. And then we also make use of it in output.php, and that we're going to make use of one of these functions in output.php. And in this particular case, in output.php, we have a output item selector, which if we look at our admin site, on our add item to department store, we can see that we have this select box that allows us to select an item in the database. Well, that's basically the way that that's built up is by calling the getItems method on our new database, that new method in our database access object, which is going to query the database for all of the items. It's going to return an array of those items so that we can build up this select box. So that's how it's used in output.php. That's how it's used in output.php, because output.php defines a static method that creates that drop-down box. In addition, on this page, add item to department.php, if we actually go and look at the source code for it, we can see that it actually is going to make use of testing whether an item exists or not, so it makes use of the items exist method as well. So let's take a look at all these different files that have changed. Start with item.php. Basically before, item.php, when it would try to load an item to view, it would call the itemsExist method, which was in our filelib.php library. And then it would try to, if it was a valid item, it would try to load the item using our getItem method. Well, basically we have these two replacement methods now in our database access class. So we're just going to replace these method calls with our new method calls. So in our new version of item.php, we can see that itemExist is called on DBA, which is a variable that we create up at the beginning of the file that creates that new database access object that's going to give us access to the MySQL database. And then we use it in the same way down here to call the getItem method to load the item from the database. As you can see up here, we've included the new data, called the constructor for database access within a try-catch block because it can throw an exception if there's an error connecting to the database. And if there is an error, we simply log it and then exit from the script. And this isn't a very graceful way to manage this exception, but it would have added a lot to the code to basically build out a more robust outputs, error processing system. So in order to keep from sort of obscuring what we're trying to learn from the code, which is how to use this database object, we're just going to have it exit. But in the production environment, just so you know that you'd want to do something more graceful than simply exiting from the script. But that's what we do in all of these different files that are making use of this database access object. If we look at department.php, department.php, when it loads the table of all the items in a particular department, it calls the getItem method on each item in the particular department. Well, in our new version, at the beginning of the file, we create our database access object, and then down in the HTML output section, we make use of that database access object stored in the variable DBA to call the getItem method to now load our items information from the database rather than the text file. Similarly, in ViewCart, we have a very similar change. This is the old version of ViewCart, and you can see that we call the getItem method basically as is the getItem method in filelib.php. Well, in our new version, we create our database access object, and then we simply load getItem, or call getItem on that database access object to load it from the particular database. So that's how we're making use of these new getItem and itemExist functions. In our add item to department script, you can see that when we attempt to add an item to department, one of the methods that it calls is it tests if an item exists or not. And if it does and it was successfully and it's able to be added, then it loads that item up, calling getItem. Well, we're going to replace that. Again, we set up our MySQL database. We have a database access constructor call. Now, out here we're not going to exit from the script if it causes an error, because we've actually built in some error processing into our admin scripts, if you remember, that is able to handle exceptions. So it's already within a try block. Our itemExist function changes to this new DBA function, and that's how we're going to add the or test the existence of the item, and we call getItem using that new getItem method as well on our database access object. So the one other thing to note is just our output class. In our output item selector, we can see now that, well, actually let's look at the previous version. We can see that it would basically load the items up calling the getItems method in our file lib. Well, now what it does is it actually is going to create a new database access object to get access to that database. It does so within a try-catch block. In this particular case, if it has an error connecting, it's going to throw the exception, which will be able to be caught in the add item to department script, and then it basically calls our getItems method that we created that's going to load that array of items from our database. If we look back at additem.php down in the output section, where we actually output or call that output item selector method, we simply have a try-catch block that's going to output a message if there was an error basically accessing the database. Again, this isn't the most graceful method for processing, for handling an error, but it simplifies our code to get at what we're trying to learn in this particular lesson. So the only other thing to mention about the changes here is that you'll notice that we've actually, this isn't in version 14.0, the last version, we had the methods, the functions getItem, getItems, and items exist in our file library. Well, since we moved them into our database access class, they no longer exist. And so we're slowly migrating from a file-based database system into our MySQL database system. So that ends today's lesson. Thank you for watching Educator.com, and look forward to seeing you next time.